Oxford Hall looked its best when it was pretending to be genteel. Built in the 1890s by a brewer anxious to launder his reputation through philanthropy, it had a facade of civic virtue and an interior of draughty corridors, varnished pine, and an aroma of cabbage that no quantity of brass polish could quite banish. On this damp September morning, it was dressed for its annual flower and produce show. Bunting drooped from the balcony. Vases of late roses guarded the doors, and the clock over the stage ticked as solemnly as if presiding over a meeting of the borough council. Inside, trestle tables sagged under marrows, onions, chrysanthemums, and jam jars. Prize cards in municipal purple were pinned at jaunty angles, and the women of the Ladies' Guild darted between exhibits with expressions suggesting both moral custody and mild suspicion. Flaxborough's gardeners and bakers had come out in force. It was their day of glory, when a symmetrical carrot might outshine a councillor's speech. Inspector Pubright arrived 10 minutes before the opening. He had been roped in to lend dignity to proceedings by presenting the trophy for best floral arrangement in a teapot. Being a polite man with no particular feelings about teapots, he accepted. He now moved slowly along the displays, hands clasped behind his back, pausing at each entry as if it were a crime scene. The habit of observation never quite left him. At the far end of the hall, against a wall of municipal green paint, Miss Teatley presided over the local history stall. Retired from the library after 43 years of service, she had kept both her zeal for cataloguing and her alarming hair. Today she had arranged pamphlets about Flaxborough's nonconformist chapels, postcards of vanished pubs, and her pride, an oak box labelled "For Display Only." It was said to contain the original minute book of the Oxford Hall Debating Society, a short-lived club from 1897 whose members included a future mayor, a disgraced vicar, and at least one lady with a hyphenated name. Whether the book was scandalous or dull no one knew, but Miss Teatley liked to hint it had marginalia of interest. She left her table only briefly, to fetch barley sugar sweets from the cloakroom where she had hidden them from small hands. 3 minutes, she later swore. When she returned, the pamphlets were still neat, the postcards unmoved, but the oak box was gone. In its place lay a faint square of dust and a snapped brass key. She stared at the empty space, mouth working like a landed fish. Then she saw Pubright a few yards away examining a pyramid of tomatoes and hissed his name as if invoking a conjuring spell. He came at once, hat tilted slightly back. "Something amiss, Miss Teatley?" "The box, Inspector. The manuscript. Vanished." Pubright regarded the table with mild interest. "Walked off, has it?"
"It cannot have walked off."
It was locked, and clearly marked "For Display Only."
"Ah," Pubright said. "Perhaps someone mistook that for an invitation." He touched the snapped brass key with a gloved finger.
"Yours?" She peered at it.
"No, I had the key in my handbag."
"This must be, the caretaker's, perhaps. But why?" "Let's not frighten the courgette growers." Purbright's voice was mild but decisive.
"Tell me exactly, you were away how long?"
3 minutes. 4 at most. He nodded and let his gaze drift around the hall. Children squealed at the novelty vegetables. Councillor Glossop was being photographed beside a marrow the size of a torpedo. The brass band at the far end was tuning up with apologetic wheezes. Only the hall caretaker seemed out of step with the bustle. He was polishing the brass doorknob of the side entrance with a concentration worthy of a neurosurgeon. Pubright walked a few paces, apparently to admire a set of runner beans, but in reality to place himself between Miss Teatley's stall and the cloakroom. He noted the proximity of the side door, unlocked with rain blowing in. He also noted Reverend Cleeve hovering by the stage curtain, muttering to himself as he flicked through some sermon notes. The words "should never be read aloud" floated faintly across the din before being swallowed by a burst of cornet. He returned to Miss Teatley. "You mentioned marginalia of interest?" Her eyes brightened behind her bifocals despite her distress. Certain annotations, Inspector. Hints of meetings held off record. Debates on, well, matters best left unsaid in polite company. Indeed. Pubright tucked the broken key into an envelope. We'll have a quiet look round. In the meantime, say nothing. The fewer people know something's missing, the less imaginative the explanations. Miss Teatley gave a small, fluttering nod.
Oh, Inspector, do you think it's serious?
That, he said, depends on how many reputations still care about 1897. He strolled away again, outwardly the picture of municipal leisure. Inwardly, he was sketching a small diagram: hall layout, side door, cloakroom, brass key, Reverend Cleeve, caretaker. The diagram felt unfinished but promising, like a crossword with 3 clues solved. Pubright never hurried. Time, in his experience, made suspects eloquent. Outside, the drizzle thickened. A poster on the hall door announced in peeling letters, Oxford Hall, 125 years of community. Pubright paused beneath it, hat brim dripping, and watched the crowd ebb and flow with their baskets of prize dahlias. He had no doubt the missing manuscript would be whispered about in 3 shops and a hairdresser's before he reached the station. In Flaxborough, gossip travelled faster than the mail train. He stepped into the rain, not yet sure whether he had a theft, a prank, or merely an overexcited librarian. But he had that familiar small-town feeling, quiet, habitual, that something ostensibly minor would prove important. Someone had moved the manuscript for a reason, and reasons in Flaxborough were rarely tidy. By the time Inspector Pubright had walked the 2 streets from Oxford Hall to the station, the missing box had already acquired 3 new owners and 2 entirely different contents, at least according to the town. Flaxborough's gossip network functioned like a pneumatic tube. Insert a rumour at one end, and it arrived at the other compressed, distorted, and travelling at alarming speed. In the queue at Clegg's Bakery, Miss Branscombe informed the chemist's wife that the manuscript was a secret will naming an illegitimate descendant of the brewer who built the hall. Across the road in the ironmonger's, Mr. Furlow was telling a customer it contained a love diary written by a bishop. By the time the story reached the market square, it had become an exposé of council corruption with hand-drawn maps of a proposed bypass. The truth, whatever it was, remained stubbornly unglamorous. Pubright, meanwhile, allowed Sergeant Love to do the listening. Love had a gift for appearing earnest while contributing nothing beyond a nod and an encouraging, "Really?" As he moved from stall to stall with his notebook discreetly tucked into a pocket, he collected fragments. The caretaker, seen hovering suspiciously by the side door. A man in a dark coat, looking scholarly, slipping out just before the band struck up. Miss Teatley's voice raised in excitement at the empty trestle. Each story contradicted the last. Love returned to the station at 11 with a notebook as fat as a pudding, but no firm facts. Pubright read it with a mild expression.
"Ah," he said, "the town is conducting our inquiry for us."
"We should be grateful." "Sir," Love said, "they're certain it was the caretaker. They're always certain it's the caretaker." He polishes doorknobs too enthusiastically. "Suspicious behaviour in Flaxborough." Pubright closed the notebook. "Still, better to ask him ourselves." Before they could, Councillor Glossop arrived at the station, steaming slightly from the drizzle and self-importance.
"Inspector," he boomed, "I trust you are investigating this outrage."
"That manuscript is of considerable civic value, quite irreplaceable. We cannot have people pilfering our heritage." Pubright gestured him into a chair. "You've read it, Councillor?" "No, but its mere existence is important." Glossop produced a folded newspaper from his briefcase as though to prove the point. "The Chronicle will make a feature of this. They're sending that young fellow, what's his name, to interview Miss Teatley this afternoon. Mr. Harpenden? That's the chap. I expect he'll blow it all up into some nonsense about secret societies." "We can't have that." Pubright gave a slight smile. "Secret societies sell papers," Glossop sniffed. "I suppose you'll find it soon enough." Some miscreant youth, I dare say. Or one of those visiting academics. He lowered his voice. People like that come sniffing round our records for all sorts of reasons. Grant's reputations. Could be blackmail. Pubright let the silence grow. Glossop, unused to not being agreed with, began to fidget. Well, he said at last, do keep me informed. He left with the air of a man who had personally moved the case forward by several inches. When he was gone, Love said, "Visiting academics, sir?"
Yes, Miss Teatley mentioned one. Mrs. Bickerstaff, wasn't it?
Antiquarian dealer of some kind.
And a junior reporter hovering.
And Reverend Cleeve muttering about things that should never be read aloud. A fine little congregation. Love waited, pencil poised. "Orders, sir." "We'll speak with the caretaker first." Then Miss Teatley again. "Let the others stew a little." The caretaker, Mr. Prynne, had spent 40 years in Oxford Hall and had the weary look of a man who knew every draft by name. He met them in the corridor by the cloakroom, polishing yet another doorknob. "Box gone, is it?" he said, not looking up. "So it seems," Pubright replied. "We're told you have a key." "Had broke this morning." He produced a ring with a gap where one had snapped off. Lock was stiff. "Been meaning to tell the council." "Where were you when the show opened?" "Stage door." Shifting chairs.
Didn't see no box. Pubright studied the man's face.
It revealed nothing except a desire to return to polishing. "Did anyone else have a key?" "Not as I know. Miss Teatley asked me to set the box out."
"I did, that's all," Love scribbled.
Pubright merely nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Prynne. We'll keep you informed." Back outside, Love said, "He could have done it." "Indeed," Pubright murmured. "And so could half the town, if we accept their stories." They crossed the square toward the tea shop, where Miss Teatley had taken refuge. Through the window she sat upright, 2 untouched scones before her, talking at speed to the young reporter, Harpenden. He, notebook poised, was clearly enjoying himself. Inside, Pubright removed his hat.
"Miss Teatley! Mr. Harpenden!" Harpenden leapt up. "Inspector!"
"I'm just getting Miss Teatley's recollection for tomorrow's Chronicle." "I'm sure you are," Pubright said mildly. "Miss Teatley, may we have a word?" She fluttered her hands.
"Of course, Inspector. Only it's extraordinary, all these questions."
"People have been phoning me already," Pubright sat. "They will? Do you recall anyone near your stall before you left?" She closed her eyes briefly. "Reverend Cleeve, I think, asked about the pamphlets. And that woman, Mrs. Bickerstaff, looked at the postcards."
"Oh, and a young man with a rucksack. Harpenden, was it you?"
"Certainly not," Harpenden said cheerfully. "I was still at the office when it happened. Dreadful business. But good copy," Pubright allowed a faint smile. "I imagine so." He asked a few more questions, nothing that seemed significant, yet each answer went into the quiet ledger of his mind. When Miss Teatley began to repeat herself, he rose. "Thank you."
"Enjoy your tea." Outside, Love said, "So far we've got a broken key, a drafty door, and a dozen suspects." "Exactly." Pubright glanced at the greying sky.
"And one small oddity, sir? The remark about pages that should never be read aloud, Reverend Cleeve. If the manuscript is dull, why say that?" Love frowned. "Maybe he just likes sounding dramatic." "Maybe," Pubright said, but his tone suggested he did not believe it. They walked back to the station, the market's chatter buzzing around them like wasps. The town had turned a missing box into a scandal, a mystery, and a mild entertainment all at once. Pubright, hands behind his back, let the noise wash over him. Somewhere in it, he felt sure, was the first real clue, buried under petals of gossip like a seed waiting to sprout. Inspector Pubright believed that listening was more profitable than questioning, provided one could do it without appearing to. On Monday morning he stationed himself at Oxford Hall under the pretext of reviewing security, but in reality to give townsfolk an opportunity to talk. Few could resist telling an inspector what they knew, especially if they thought he already knew it. The hall had been restored to its usual echoing emptiness. The scent of chrysanthemums lingered faintly, along with a ghost of damp overcoats. The trestles were stacked, the bunting taken down, but the square of dust where the manuscript box had sat remained like a pale birthmark on the floor. Pubright stood over it for a moment, hat tilted back, then moved on to the caretaker's office. Mr. Prynne looked up from a tin mug of tea. "Morning, Inspector."
Come about the box again?
"Just tying threads." Purbright's tone was mild. "You said you set the box out yourself?" "Aye." Miss Teatley brought it in a carrier bag.
Heavy it was.
"Said it hadn't been opened in years. I put it on the table, locked it. Gave the key back. No one else about? Not then. Later on, the Reverend comes sniffing round. And that fancy dealer woman, Bickerstaff."
And some lad with a camera. Purbright's eyes moved to the window.
"What camera?"
Black thing round his neck.
"Could have been a reporter," Prynne shrugged. "I've seen all sorts." "Thank you." Pubright pocketed the information like a coin and left without further comment. In the library reading room, Miss Teatley sat amid stacks of municipal records like a queen among her papers. She rose when Pubright entered, smoothing her skirt with nervous hands. "Inspector, have you found it?"
Not yet. I need your help filling gaps. He took a chair opposite her.
"This manuscript, have you ever read it?" She looked almost affronted. "Good gracious, no. The county rules are clear. Display only."
I've only seen the first page. Committee minutes, dull as anything.
But there were penciled notes in the margins. Someone had written names crossed out some.
I suppose that's why people think it's scandalous. Pubright inclined his head.
"Do you recall any names?" She hesitated. "I thought I saw Cleve. But that must have been another Cleve a century ago. Perhaps." Pubright allowed the word to drift between them like a feather. "And Mrs. Bickerstaff?" "Oh, she calls herself an antiquarian, but she's a dealer. Buys parish records from churches closing down. She wanted to buy the manuscript, of course, but I refused. I told her it belonged to the borough." Pubright waited. Miss Teatley's lips tightened. She said some things shouldn't be left in public hands. That was only yesterday morning." "Indeed," Pubright made a note.
And Reverend Cleve?
"He's always rummaging in archives for sermon material."
I lent him the Debating Society's pamphlets once.
He returned them with bookmarks in curious places. Curious? Margaret Hobson's address, for one. She was a suffragist here in 1898. He said it was for a talk on the moral perils of agitation. Miss Teatley sniffed. "He likes a little drama." Pubright thanked her and rose. "One more thing. Did you notice a brass key on your table before the box vanished?" "No, I found it only after you pointed it out." "Where did it come from?" "That," Pubright said, "is what I should like to know." Back at the station, Sergeant Love was waiting with 2 tepid cups of tea and a small heap of notes. "Been digging, sir. Mrs. Bickerstaff's in town again today, viewing some parish silver at St. Jude's. Reverend Cleve's taken himself off to the rectory to prepare a lecture, and the caretaker says the hall's side door lock sticks unless you give it a good yank." Pubright accepted the tea. "A useful property for a thief," Love leaned forward. "So do you think it's about money? That manuscript can't be worth much?" "Sometimes," Pubright said. "The price of a thing is not in pounds, but in embarrassment. People will go to considerable trouble to prevent an old paper seeing daylight." Love scribbled. "Should we bring them in for questioning?" "Not yet, we listen." "People are never more revealing than when they believe you know less than you do." He set out to listen further. St. Jude's stood at the edge of town where the housing thinned into allotments. Inside its vestry, Mrs. Bickerstaff, a brisk woman with a fox fur collar and a nose for antiques, was inspecting a silver chalice. Pubright waited until she finished her negotiations with the verger before stepping forward. "Mrs. Bickerstaff," he said politely. "Inspector Pubright."
May I ask you about Saturday's show?
Her eyes flickered, but she smiled. "Of course. Such a charming event."
Marrows the size of torpedoes. I should have taken photographs. You looked at Miss Teatley's stall? I did. I was interested in the manuscript box.
"A lovely piece of oak."
I offered to purchase it, purely for preservation, and she refused?
"Quite rudely." Mrs. Bickerstaff's smile tightened. "Said the borough would never sell. A pity, really." Private collectors take better care than councils. Pubright let the silence stretch. Mrs. Bickerstaff filled it with a little laugh. I do hope nothing has happened to it.
It has gone missing. Goodness. Her eyebrows rose. How extraordinary. Pubright inclined his head.
Indeed. He thanked her and withdrew before she could embroider further. Walking back through the market square, Pubright stopped at the newsstand. The Chronicle's headline read, Mystery of Missing Manuscript, Secret of Oxford Hall. Underneath was Harpenden's breathless prose about lost revelations and civic intrigue. Pubright bought a copy, folded it neatly, and tucked it under his arm. Every rumour printed was another stone thrown into the pond. Sooner or later the ripples would reveal who was standing at the edge. At the station, Love asked, Anything? Only that Mrs. Bickerstaff wanted the manuscript badly enough to offer money, and Reverend Cleeve's name may be in the margins of a century-old, minute book. Pubright placed the newspaper on his desk. We shall see who else thinks so. Love hesitated. What about the young man with the camera? We'll find him. Reporters have a way of coming to us eventually. He turned to the window. The town beyond the glass looked perfectly ordinary. Buses wheezing past, shoppers with their string bags, pigeons marching along the curb. Yet in its quiet corners, reputations stirred uneasily like curtains lifting in a draught. Pubright clasped his hands behind his back. Sergeant, he said softly, let us wait. And listen. Councillor Glossop summoned Inspector Pubright to his office with the kind of note that implied a royal command rather than a municipal request. The council chamber occupied the first floor of the town hall, a room of heavy oak panels and heavier civic self-regard. Glossop had arranged himself at the head of the table, beneath a portrait of a former mayor who looked as though he had disapproved of everything since 1904. A tray with 2 untouched cups of tea stood nearby, the milk already developing a skin. Inspector! Glossop rose, hand extended like a benevolent monarch.
Come in, come in.
I assume you're making progress. Pubright took the offered chair without haste. We're assembling the facts, he said mildly. Facts, yes. Glossop leaned forward, eyes shining. But the facts are plain.
It's obvious who took the thing, is it?
Pubright allowed a hint of curiosity to enter his tone. Do enlighten me. Glossop sat back, satisfied at being asked. Some wayward youth?
A student or... He lowered his voice dramatically. One of those foreign tourists. They wander about, don't they? Poke into things.
See a box and think it's a souvenir.
That's what we're dealing with, Inspector. Petty theft, nothing more. Pubright inclined his head. You're certain of that?
Certain enough. Glossop began counting on his fingers. First, the caretaker's door was open. Second, the hall was full of strangers. Third, the item itself has no monetary value to anyone in Flaxborough.
Ergo outsider. Pubright did not contradict him.
He simply folded his hands and waited. Glossop, encouraged, continued. I spoke to Mrs. Bickerstaff myself.
Harmless woman.
Wouldn't dream of taking anything.
And as for Reverend Cleeve, well, he's a clergyman. They don't steal manuscripts. No, we mustn't cast aspersions on respectable citizens.
This has all the hallmarks of a casual pilfering by some passing tramp. Did you see such a person?
Pubright asked politely. No, Glossop admitted.
But others did. I heard from Mrs. Lant, the treasurer of the Horticultural Society, that a young fellow with a rucksack slipped out the side door just before the band struck up. She's quite reliable, Pubright nodded.
And Mrs. Lant described him?
Brown hair, I think, or perhaps fair.
A coat of some sort.
Foreign-looking, she said. Eastern European, probably. They're everywhere these days. Pubright allowed his eyes to drift to the portrait on the wall, whose painted stare seemed to deepen.
Interesting. Glossop mistook the word for agreement. Exactly.
We'll issue a notice to the railway station. If he tries to leave town with the box under his arm, we'll have him. Pubright said nothing. Glossop tapped the table for emphasis.
You see, Inspector, the council can't afford a scandal.
We've just applied for heritage funding. If the press starts babbling about secret manuscripts and cover-ups, well, donors dislike controversy. Best to frame this as a simple matter of theft by an outsider. Clean and quick, Pubright repeated as though testing the sound. Very prudent, Glossop warmed to his theme. Indeed.
And we mustn't involve the Chronicle any further.
That young reporter, Harpenden, is turning this into a melodrama. Talks of lost revelations, civic intrigue, nonsense. If you would give me a statement denying any impropriety, I'll see it printed at once. Pubright tilted his head. Impropriety? Well, Glossop said with a little cough, there are always rumours about old records. But of course there's nothing in them. Nothing anyone respectable would care about.
Ancient debates, temperance meetings, dull stuff. Even if someone were to read it aloud, it would bore the audience to death. Quite. Purbright's voice was so mild it could have been mistaken for indifference.
You've read it then? Glossop blinked.
No, of course not. I'm far too busy.
But one hears things. Harmless gossip. Pubright let a silence open. Glossop shifted in his seat.
Anyway, he said briskly, you'll recover it soon, I'm sure.
Some little hooligan probably left it on the train already.
You'll have it back before the week's out. Pubright rose slowly, brushing an invisible speck from his sleeve.
I shall do my best. As he moved to the door, Glossop called after him. You'll issue a statement then?
About the outsider theory?
Pubright paused. It's a possibility, he said evenly. One of several. Glossop's mouth opened as though to object. But Pubright was already in the corridor, the door closing with the soft finality of a sermon's last hymn. Outside in the corridor, Sergeant Love was waiting on a hard bench, notebook ready. How'd it go, sir? Pubright adjusted his hat. Councillor Glossop has solved the case for us. A wayward youth or foreign tourist? Love raised an eyebrow. Convenient, extremely, especially for anyone with a motive inside the town. They walked slowly down the staircase, their footsteps echoing off the stone. Love said, You didn't contradict him? No. Pubright smiled faintly. When a man is building a neat conclusion, it's instructive to see how much rope he gives himself. They emerged into the square. The drizzle had returned, soft as breath on glass. Across the way, a group of pensioners huddled under the bus shelter were already rehearsing the story of the foreign thief, their gestures expanding with each retelling.
Love shook his head.
It's everywhere already. Yes, Pubright said. And the louder a story is told, the more it hides what matters. We shall listen to the quieter voices. He stopped at the edge of the pavement, gazing at the grey bulk of Oxford Hall. Its windows looked blind and respectable. Yet somewhere behind them a small truth waited like a letter in an uncollected postbox. Pubright adjusted his collar against the rain. Sergeant, he said softly, let's have another look at Reverend Cleave's bookmarks. Love scribbled obediently. And Mrs. Bickerstaff? In due course. Pubright began walking again, hands behind his back. For now we let Councillor Glossop enjoy his conclusion.
It may yet lead him to something he didn't intend. Behind them, the bells of St. Jude's struck noon, echoing across the square.
Flaxborough bustled on, secure in its narrative of an outsider thief. Only Pubright, moving through the drizzle like a patient shadow, seemed untouched by the town's certainty. Inspector Pubright returned to Oxford Hall before 9, when even gossip moved sluggishly and the corridors smelled of floor polish. Mr. Prynne, the caretaker, was ferrying chairs with the patient gloom of a man who had outlived 6 committees. The square of dust where the manuscript box had sat was still visible on the trestle. I'll just look in the cloakroom, Pubright said. Prynne grunted consent. The cloakroom offered its usual still life, umbrellas like tethered herons, council coats, a green bicycle cape. On the small counter lay a white envelope half tucked beneath a folded poster. It was stamped in purple, flower show raffle, tickets. Across the flap, someone had penciled in tidy capitals, teapot, cake, hamper, to be drawn by Reverend C. The envelope felt oddly heavy. Inside were unused ticket books, the perforated strips still joined in neat coils, and a handful of counterfoils already torn, numbered into the 70s. The Ladies' Guild ran their raffles with military decorum. The counterfoils ought to have been with the treasurer, not sunning themselves among raincoats. On the back, in a rougher hand, another note, pp. 14 16 32 47. Temperance debate. The quotation marks looked self-conscious. Pubright replaced the contents and shut the door. Outside, Prynne looked up from his chairs. Yours? Pubright asked, nodding toward the envelope. Good Lord, no.
Ladies' Guild, Prynne sniffed.
They lose more paper than a printer. Who used the cloakroom on Saturday?
Everyone. Door was on the latch.
Reverend kept his coat in there. So did Councillor Glossop, after he dropped jam on his cuff. Pubright thanked him and crossed the square to the church hall, where Mrs. Lant, the guild treasurer, was auditing the remains of refreshments with Quartermaster gravity. Inspector, she said, if you've come about the raffle, we mislaid one envelope during the show. Caused flurry. Reverend Cleeve drew the numbers, very stirring. People love a moral man with a teapot. An envelope with counterfoils? Pubright asked. Yes, I found it later in the cloakroom, would you believe?
Not where it belonged at all. And someone had scribbled book pages on the back.
I told the Reverend it was naughty to waste stationery. What did he say? He laughed. Said it was an aid memoir. Then he grew solemn and told me some pages are best never read aloud. Mrs. Lant lowered her voice. I took that to mean the Chronicle shouldn't go snooping. Quite. Pubright accepted a biscuit he did not want and left her to count oatcakes. At the rectory he found Reverend Cleeve in his study amid a shipwreck of books. The minister greeted him with the tired benevolence of a man persecuted by parish drains. Inspector, how may I be of help?
Terrible business about Miss Teatley's box. A small thing, Pubright said.
A raffle envelope in the hall cloakroom carried page numbers with quotation marks. Cleeve's eyes performed a leisurely blink. Notes for a talk. Temperance debates of the 1890s. Dry as a sermon left in the oven. You remarked to Mrs. Lant that some pages should never be read aloud. Did I? A turn of phrase only. He smiled, pastoral and practised. Victorian minutes can be uncharitable. They name names. A public reading might distress descendants. Indeed. Pubright let silence stroll about the room.
Did you handle Miss Teatley's box?
Only to admire the craftsmanship.
Oak lends dignity to trifles. He folded his hands.
Was the envelope not in proper hands?
In the cloakroom. A wayward billet doux, Pubright said, rising.
Thank you, Reverend. Back at the station, Sergeant Love was ready with his notebook. Pubright laid the uneaten biscuit on the blotter. 2 items, he said. The raffle envelope wandered, and it carried page references to the temperance debates. Love frowned. Meaning? Meaning our missing manuscript is unlikely to be random loot. Someone knew what to look for and what not to let be read aloud. Cleeve? Perhaps. He is self-aware enough to put quotation marks round his worries. Pubright opened the drawer and removed the envelope containing the snapped brass key. Also, the cloakroom absorbed more traffic than the station. A knock announced Harpenden, the junior reporter, entering with the apology of youth. Inspector, off the record, any comment on seditious minutes? It would help me avoid libel. Off the record, Mr. Harpenden. Rumours are seldom guilty, only industrious. Harpenden brightened. May I steal that? If you must. Tell me, did you record anything behind the stage on Saturday? He coloured. A little. Testing a microphone.
Caught the Reverend telling Councillor.
Glossop certain pages were pastoral dynamite and ought not to be read in a noisy hall. Glossop said he'd see to it. Then the band started and I lost the rest. When was this? Just before the raffle draw. The Reverend went to fetch his coat. Glossop followed. After he had gone, Love whistled. Pastoral dynamite. And see to it, Pubright repeated. He stared at the brass key as if it might offer a hymn. Collect from Miss Teatley the pamphlets she once lent the Reverend. I wish to see where his bookmarks pause to take breath. Love rose.
And the envelope?
Leave it exactly where it should not be, Pubright said. Misplacement is sometimes the only honest thing people do. He stood at the window. The square lay in its respectable grey, but the case had changed colour in his mind. The vanished box no longer felt like whim. It had been removed along a quiet domestic route, cloakroom, raffle, coat, a murmured promise. The trivialities, the snapped key, the wandering envelope, the quotation marks, were aligning like faint stars into something navigable. He did not yet know where the constellation pointed, only that it was forming. Pubright turned to his paperwork, humming a bar of nothing. Outside, reputations arranged their faces for the day. Inside, a list of page numbers waited with the obedience of a dog at a closed door. Flaxborough did not so much expand as accumulate. The same people appeared in different rooms, wearing slightly different hats. By Tuesday afternoon, Inspector Pubright had invited 3 of them to the police station's modest interview room, one at a time, lest their grievances ferment into a brawl. Each represented a new ring around the missing manuscript: Mrs. Bickerstaff, the antiquarian dealer, Mr. Harpenden, the junior reporter, and Dr. Clarice Houghton, a visiting academic with an ear for gossip as keen as for footnotes. Mrs. Bickerstaff arrived first. She was brisk, perfumed faintly of camphor, and carried a crocodile handbag whose clasp snapped like a verdict. She sat down without being asked. "Inspector, I do hope this won't take long," she said. "I have a train to Lincoln to catch." "Only a few questions," Pubright replied mildly. "You examined the manuscript box on Saturday?" "I did indeed. Oak, late 19th century amateur carving. Not valuable as furniture, but historically interesting. I offered to purchase it for safekeeping. Miss Teatley refused, very tartly, I might add. You collect municipal records?" "I preserve them," she corrected. "Councils lose papers in damp basements. Private hands take better care."
"I donate to universities." "Were you aware of the content of the manuscript?"
"No, I assume dull minutes, though rumours always attach to such things. Secret debates, temperance scandals, Flaxborough's little dramas."
"I'm not in the business of blackmail, Inspector." Pubright let a silence settle. Mrs. Bickerstaff smoothed her gloves.
"Oh, may I go?" "In a moment," Pubright said. "Where were you at the moment the box vanished?" She pursed her lips, inspecting the jam display.
"A lady had produced a jar with a remarkable seal." She rose. "If that is all for now," Pubright said.
He watched her leave, handbag clicking. Harpenden, the reporter, entered next, hat in hand, smiling with the unbothered air of someone who sees news as weather rather than crime. He perched on the edge of the chair. "Inspector, I'm flattered to be summoned." "You were at the hall before the disappearance?"
"No, arrived after."
"But I'd set up some audio tests earlier in the week."
"Old microphone by the stage."
It still had battery. "Caught a snippet of conversation on Saturday." Pubright raised an eyebrow. "Between whom?" "Reverend Cleeve and Councillor Glossop. Something about pages that were pastoral dynamite and shouldn't be read aloud in a noisy hall. Then the band started and drowned it. I wrote it in my notes but haven't published it yet." Pubright inclined his head. "Your notes may be of interest," Harpenden grinned.
"I knew you'd say that. I've brought a copy." He slid a folded sheet across the table.
"My editor thinks we'll get 2 days' headlines out of this. Secret manuscript rocks Civic Hall. You enjoy rocking things?" "It sells papers." Harpenden leaned forward. "But between us, Inspector, I think there's a cover-up. This town's always had one foot in Victorian piety and the other in some very odd cupboards." Pubright said nothing. Harpenden chuckled. "You're a hard man to bait. All right, I'll keep you informed if anything new turns up." He tipped his hat and left as lightly as he had entered. Dr. Clarice Houghton arrived last. She was a spare, alert woman in her 40s, wearing a rain-damp trench coat and carrying a leather portfolio bulging with papers. She introduced herself crisply. "Department of Local History, University of North Trent. I'm on sabbatical studying temperance movements. I'd arranged to view the Oxford Hall manuscript next month." Imagine my surprise when it disappeared. "Indeed," Pubright said.
"How did you know it had disappeared?"
"Mrs. Bickerstaff telephoned me," she said with a faint smile. "We share information. She thought I might have notes on its contents."
I don't, of course.
I was hoping to see the marginalia. Names of speakers, financial backers, that sort of thing. You suspect something particular? She hesitated. Rumour only. The debating society was said to have discussed not merely drink, but land deals. Certain families still prominent in Flaxborough were involved.
That could be embarrassing. Pubright folded his hands. And your view of Mrs. Bickerstaff?
An efficient vulture. She swoops before the paperwork cools, but useful. Councils let archives rot.
She rescues them. And Reverend Cleave?
A moralist with a taste for sensation. He wrote to me last month asking if I knew where the debating society's minutes were kept. I told him they were with Miss Teatley. He never replied. Pubright let this settle like dust. Where were you on Saturday? Leicester. Conference on nonconformist hymnals.
I can produce the programme. She opened her portfolio, but Pubright raised a hand. That won't be necessary. He stood.
Thank you, Dr. Houghton. As she gathered her papers, she added, If you do recover the manuscript, Inspector, I'd be glad of access. Purely academic, of course. Purbright's smile was polite, but unrevealing. We shall see. When she had gone, Sergeant Love entered with 2 mugs of tea. That's quite a cast, sir. Dealer, reporter, academic.
All sniffing round the same box? Yes, Pubright said.
He sipped his tea and looked at the 3 chairs now empty. And each with a grievance. Mrs. Bickerstaff resents the council for refusing her offers. Mr. Harpenden wants headlines. Dr. Houghton wants her research unspoiled. Plenty of motives, Love said. But who actually took it? Pubright did not answer at once. He opened Harpenden's note and read the quoted remark again, pages that were pastoral dynamite. He tapped the words with a finger. Sergeant, fetch me the booking ledger for Oxford Hall. I want to know who had keys last month. Love frowned. You think it was arranged before Saturday? I think, Pubright said softly, that our manuscript didn't vanish in a fit of impulse. It walked out through a door already opened for it. He rose, hands behind his back, and looked out of the window at the square. The drizzle had stopped. People moved about with the complacency of a town that believed it knew its own secrets. Only Purbright's eyes followed a different pattern, mapping connections invisible to the street below. The circle around the manuscript had widened, but its centre was becoming clearer. He turned back to his desk. Let them all talk a little more, he murmured. Sometimes the echo gives away the room. It was Sergeant Love who first smelled the smoke. He had been dispatched to Oxford Hall on Wednesday morning to photograph the square of dust where the manuscript had been and to take a rubbing of the snapped brass key. The hall stood empty under a sky the colour of a pewter teapot, its windows blind with condensation. Love had just unlocked the side entrance when a thin, acrid thread caught his nose. He pushed open the door to the little side office used for bookings and minor accounts. A curl of grey smoke rose from the waste paper bin, where blackened fragments hissed like burnt leaves. The window was shut, no draught to feed it. He stamped once, twice, and the glow died, leaving a scorched smell of damp paper and scorched ink. Nothing else seemed touched. The desk was intact, the filing cabinet closed, but on the blotter lay a half-charred ledger. Its cover read Oxford Hall, bookings and keys. The first pages were intact. The middle had been burned through to a brittle crescent. Love fetched his camera and took photographs before phoning the station. Pubright arrived 20 minutes later, stepping out of the drizzle with his usual mild expression. He examined the bin, the desk, the ledger, and then Love's photographs. Accidental? Love asked. Fires seldom break out in ledgers by themselves, Pubright said. He touched the edge of the charred book. The ash flaked like black snow. What remains? Love opened it carefully. We've got entries up to August. Everything from September onwards gone. That includes last Saturday's key allocations. Convenient, Pubright murmured.
Anything else missing? Not that I can tell.
Petty cash tin untouched. Old gas heater switched off at the wall. Door locked when I arrived. Pubright glanced at the window. The latch showed faint scratches.
Who else has a key to this office?
Caretaker, treasurer, counsellor in charge of bookings, Glossop. Pubright made no comment. He turned instead to the wastepaper basket and lifted a surviving scrap with tweezers. The char pattern suggested several sheets folded together. On the back, in faint pencil, he could just discern a name, Cleve. He placed it in an envelope and straightened. "Sergeant, you'll call the fire brigade for a formal note. Then visit Miss Teatley. Ask whether she has any copy of Saturday's key register." "Right, sir." Love hesitated.
You think someone started this to hide who had access?
Purbright's eyes held a mild gleam. If our manuscript vanished through a door already opened for it, a burned ledger spares the doorkeeper embarrassment. By midday, the news had already escaped the cordon. Shoppers on the high street spoke of an arson attack on the hall and vandalism by that same foreigner who stole the book. Councillor Glossop, summoned from a luncheon, arrived flustered and loud. "Inspector! What's this I hear about a fire?" He peered into the office as though expecting dramatic flames. Terrible business. But at least nothing valuable burned. "The ledger of bookings," Pubright said. Glossop waved a hand. "Old scribbles. Nothing irreplaceable." "It recorded key allocations," Pubright said mildly. Glossop's smile stiffened. "I'm sure duplicates exist." "They do not," Pubright replied. "Miss Teatley confirmed she kept no copy for September." Glossop's face coloured. "Well, one can't expect perfection."
Probably some bored youth.
Or the caretaker smoking again. Pubright did not contradict him. He let the councillor speak himself into a tangle about fire regulations, caretaker discipline, and foreign insurance frauds. By the time Glossop left, he had implicated 3 absent parties and contradicted 2 of his own statements. Pubright watched him go, the faintest curve of amusement at his lips. Later that afternoon, Pubright visited Reverend Cleve at the rectory again. The minister, more agitated than before, greeted him with a damp handshake. "Another incident, Inspector."
I heard rumours of fire. A small one. Only the ledger burned. Purbright's voice was almost conversational. Curious, isn't it, how often trivial things suffer accidents?
Cleve looked away. "Very curious. You handled the raffle envelope on Saturday. Did you also borrow the key register?" "Certainly not," Cleve said quickly. "Why would I?" "That is what I'm wondering." Pubright examined a shelf of hymnals. "You once wrote to Dr. Houghton about the Debating Society's minutes. Interested in their membership?" "It was purely for research."
A sermon series on civic duty.
"Victorian lessons for modern times. Valuable lessons." Pubright turned back. "Did you tell Councillor Glossop some pages were pastoral dynamite?" Cleve blinked. "He repeats everything, does he?"
I'm asking. Yes, Cleve said at last.
"But only as a joke."
Old minutes can be colourful.
Glossop likes a whiff of scandal, makes him feel indispensable. Pubright regarded him a moment longer, then left without another word. At the station, Love spread the surviving scraps from the waste paper basket across blotting paper. "We got 6 pieces, sir."
Mostly ash.
"But this one's clear enough. Cleve access key held by..." And then it breaks off. "Interesting," Pubright said softly. "Not proof, but a thread." "Think the Reverend did the burning?" "Too soon to tell. People often act to protect others rather than themselves. Or they imagine they are." Love frowned at the grey flakes. "Who benefits from the ledger disappearing?" "Anyone who held a key on Saturday," Pubright said, "including those who later claimed they did not." He moved to the window. Oxford Hall sat across the square, its stone glowing damply. The townsfolk were already back to their routines, yet a new unease flickered beneath their glances, as if the small fire had scorched more than paper. "Sergeant," he said, "begin a quiet list. Who had keys last month? Who handled that manuscript box? Who spoke of pages never to be read aloud?"
No questions yet.
"Just names," Love nodded. "And if someone asks?" "Tell them the inspector is merely listening," Pubright said. "That usually makes them talk faster." He returned to his desk, where the charred scrap with Cleve lay like a singed calling card. The case no longer resembled a casual theft. A door had been opened, a book removed, a ledger burned. In Flaxborough, even small crimes carried the shape of someone's reputation. Pubright clasped his hands behind his back and began to hum softly, the tune as patient and unresolved as the investigation itself. Inspector Pubright liked to take his lunch alone in the little park behind the station, a square of clipped grass and elderly benches bordered by railings painted the colour of resignation. On Thursday the sky hung low and colourless. Sparrows picked at invisible crumbs. He sat with his sandwich unopened on his knee, staring at the ornamental pond where nothing had stirred for years except the town's reputation for respectability. Flaxborough's virtues, he reflected, resembled the pond, apparently still, faintly green and deeper in parts than anyone admitted. Respectability here was a habit more than a principle, like wearing a hat or pronouncing garage in the old way. People held it until the effort of secrecy became heavier than the sin itself. Then a quiet rearrangement occurred. Papers vanished, ledgers burned, whispers leaked through doors. In the end, the truth came out not with a bang but a polite cough. He thought of Miss Teatley's trembling excitement, Reverend Cleeve's nervous humour, Mrs. Bickerstaff's brisk acquisitiveness, Glossop's rehearsed indignation. Each was playing a part in some small civic drama. Only the manuscript sat silent at the centre like a prop, removed before the curtain rose. Pubright unwrapped his sandwich and did not eat it. He was considering doors. The manuscript had left Oxford Hall through one opened not by accident but by routine. Someone had known which key to use and when to use it. That someone, he felt sure, was not motivated by money. Embarrassment, perhaps. Prevention. The kind of motive Flaxborough excelled at. A shadow fell across the bench. Sergeant Love stood there with 2 paper cups of tea. "Thought you might want this, sir." Pubright accepted it.
Thank you. Any news?
"Only chatter," Love said, sitting down. "Caretaker swears he never lent keys. Mrs. Bickerstaff's gone back to Lincoln but told someone at the station she'd pay handsomely for the manuscript if it turned up. Reverend Cleeve's busy drafting a lecture on civic duty. Dr. Houghton's still in town for research." "Research," Pubright repeated softly. Love took a sip of tea. "If you don't mind me saying, sir, the whole business feels like parish politics on a grand scale." Pubright turned to him.
How so?
"Well," Love said, "in the parish I grew up in, the vestry kept a special box of notes on who owed what to whom, unpaid tithes, family scandals, all that. If anyone wanted to get rid of it, they'd never destroy the box. They'd just take it home quietly until the fuss blew over. Then it would come back with half the pages missing." Purbright's eyes brightened faintly. "And did the fuss blow over?" "Not really. People whispered worse than what was written. We never did know what was actually in it." Pubright stared at the pond. "Interesting. What was the box called?" "The Register of Necessities," Love said with a grin. "Not very pious, but accurate." They sat in silence for a moment. A dog trotted past, paused to examine them, and moved on. Pubright spoke again, more to himself than to Love. "In a small town," he said, "paper can be more dangerous than people. You can refute a rumour, but not handwriting. The manuscript may be dull on the surface, yet contain one name in the margin capable of toppling a respectable memory."
That would be enough to make someone burn a ledger. Love nodded slowly. You think Reverend Cleeve? I think Reverend Cleeve is anxious, Pubright said.
"But anxiety and guilt are distant cousins."
I'm not yet sure which one he's related to. He finished his tea and set the cup on the bench.
Glossop is louder than usual. That always means something. Either he knows more than he says, or he suspects someone close to him does. Could be Mrs. Bickerstaff, Love offered. She'd profit from a scandal. "True," Pubright murmured. "But profit alone seldom produces careful timing. This was not a smash and grab. It was a borrowing executed under cover of civic routine," Love frowned. "So what's the thread, sir?" Purbright's eyes moved to the church spire visible beyond the rooftops. "Parish records," he said softly. "Temperance debates.
Land deals. Reverend Cleeve asked Dr. Houghton about the manuscript last month.
He also drew the raffle, handled the envelope, fetched his coat at the crucial moment, and stood near the side door. Councillor Glossop followed him, and the box vanished and the ledger burned. He rose, brushing crumbs from his coat, though none had fallen. We must look not at who wanted the manuscript, but at who wanted to control its story. That, Sergeant, is the thread Love scribbled in his notebook. Orders?
2, Pubright said.
First, obtain a list from the county archive of all temperance debates held at Oxford Hall in 1897 and the names of speakers. Second, find out who now owns the parcels of land once leased to the debating society's patrons. Quietly, Love closed the notebook.
And the Reverend?
Let him prepare his lecture, Pubright said. Sometimes a man reveals more in his sermon than in his confession. He began walking back to the station. Love fell in step beside him. You know, sir, Love said, I sometimes think you enjoy these mysteries. Pubright smiled faintly. Mystery is the town's natural state. I merely tidy it. They crossed the square, where shoppers moved with their habitual caution under the grey sky. Oxford Hall loomed ahead, its windows blank, its secrets busily rearranging themselves. Pubright felt the mental thread tighten in his hand. Not yet a rope, but enough to tug. Inside the station, he went straight to his desk, took out the charred scrap bearing Cleeve's name, and pinned it to the edge of his blotter. Beside it, he placed the copy of Harpenden's notes, quoting Pastoral Dynamite. The two pieces of paper looked harmless, but in Purbright's mind, they formed a bridge between Saturday's disappearance and Wednesday's fire. He regarded them for a long moment, then began to draft a brief letter to the county archive requesting the list of debates. His pen moved slowly, evenly, as though drawing a net. Outside, the church bells struck 1. In Flaxborough, the sound was taken for granted. In Purbright's ears, it echoed like a countdown. The station canteen was hardly a venue for drama. It smelled of tea, disinfectant, and the faint melancholy of sausage rolls kept warm too long. Its long formica tables had seen more police paperwork than conversation. Inspector Pubright chose it precisely for that reason. No one expected revelations over chipped mugs and a plate of custard creams. At 3 o'clock, he invited 4 people to tea. Mrs. Bickerstaff, Reverend Cleeve, Councillor Glossop, and Dr. Clarice Houghton. Each received a polite note. The inspector would be grateful for your assistance in clarifying certain details. Refreshments provided.
None declined.
Curiosity was a civic duty in Flaxborough. Pubright arrived first, placing a brown envelope on the counter, where Mrs. Peel, the canteen manager, could see it, but not read it. Sergeant Love hovered nearby with a notebook, outwardly a waiter, inwardly an observer. Mrs. Bickerstaff entered briskly, shedding raindrops from her fox fur collar. "Inspector, how thoughtful," she said, eyes darting round as though the tea might be an auction. Reverend Cleeve followed, coat damp, expression composed, but his fingers worrying at a small notebook in his pocket. Glossop arrived last, booming greetings and shaking imaginary hands. Dr. Houghton came quietly, trench coat neatly folded over her arm, eyes alert. "Please," Pubright said mildly, indicating the table. "A little tea to warm us." They sat, mugs before them, steam rising like a discreet curtain. Pubright poured milk slowly, his voice conversational. "We're nearly done sorting our little puzzle. I'm grateful for your patience."
Only a few clarifications remain. Mrs. Bickerstaff smiled a tight smile.
"We're all eager to see the culprit unmasked, Inspector." "So am I," Pubright said. He passed round the custard creams. Miss Teatley was distraught, of course. A manuscript locked for decades suddenly vanishes.
"Odd how the past resists being filed away," Glossop harumphed. "Dreadful nuisance. Outsider, as I said."
"Probably left town already." "Possibly." Pubright stirred his tea. "Or possibly not. What fascinates me is the marginalia." The word slipped into the steam like a pebble into still water. Reverend Cleeve's hand froze on his mug. Mrs. Bickerstaff's eyes flickered. Dr. Houghton raised an eyebrow. Glossop looked blank. Marginalia? He asked. The notes in the manuscript's margins, Pubright said softly.
Pencil marks, names, some crossed out.
Some, perhaps, belonging to families still active in Flaxborough. Interesting reading, no doubt. Cleve cleared his throat. Purely historical, I'm sure. Historical, Pubright echoed. Yet worth burning a ledger for. Silence stretched. Glossop glanced from one face to another. Ledger?
Ah, you hadn't heard?
Pubright said mildly. A small fire in Oxford Hall's side office destroyed the bookings and key records for September. A pity. We shall have to rely on memory instead. Mrs. Bickerstaff sipped her tea with unnecessary delicacy. Dr. Houghton's pen tapped once against her mug.
Only Cleve spoke. I hardly think anyone here, he began, then stopped. Anyone here?
Pubright prompted gently. I mean, Cleve said, any respectable person would risk, well, arson. No, Pubright agreed. Respectable people do not risk arson. They act to protect others, or what they imagine should be protected. Sometimes a reputation, sometimes a sermon, sometimes a land deed. Cleve's eyes flickered toward Glossop, who shifted in his seat. Pubright went on in the same mild tone. Dr. Houghton tells me the debating society discussed not only drink but land deals. Names of patrons, financiers.
Interesting to see who held leases then and who holds them now, Glossop blustered.
Old history. Nothing to do with me? Of course not, Pubright said. Yet the marginalia might confuse the uninformed. A century-old name can look very like a present one. Mrs. Bickerstaff set down her mug with a click. Inspector, is this an inquiry or a parlour game? A little of both. Pubright leaned back. Games reveal character. For instance, when I mentioned marginalia, only one of you stopped moving. All eyes turned to Cleve. He flushed. Coincidence, he said.
I was merely surprised, of course. Pubright's voice was kind.
You handled the raffle envelope. You fetched your coat. You were near the side door at the crucial moment. Yet perhaps you didn't remove the manuscript for yourself. Perhaps you acted on behalf of someone who feared its notes might be read aloud in a noisy hall. Cleve's fingers tightened on his notebook. I can't prove anything yet, Pubright said gently. But I can listen.
And I can observe.
And when people talk, they often reveal who they're trying to protect. Glossop stood abruptly.
Really, Inspector, this is intolerable. I've a committee. Do sit down, Councillor, Pubright said softly.
Something in his tone pinned Glossop to the chair more firmly than handcuffs. The councillor sank back, colour high. Pubright folded his hands. The manuscript will be returned, perhaps anonymously, perhaps by post. Its disappearance has already drawn more attention than its contents ever could. If it arrives at my office tomorrow, I shall treat it as misplacement rather than theft.
Otherwise?
He let the sentence drift like smoke. Cleve swallowed.
You can't understand.
Those minutes, those notes, they were written by foolish men long dead. Names repeated, rumours magnified. To read them aloud now would be to slander the innocent. Then you've read them, Pubright said softly. Cleve's mouth opened and closed. Mrs. Bickerstaff gave a small, satisfied hiss of breath. Dr. Houghton merely watched. Glossop dabbed his forehead with a handkerchief. Pubright rose. Thank you all for your time. Tea's on the house. He moved to the counter, leaving them in a silence thick with unspoken things. Behind him, Love caught his eye. The sergeant's notebook remained closed. He had not needed to write a word. The inspector's test had done its work. Outside the canteen window, the square lay grey and damp, the town moving in its usual patterns. Yet Pubright felt the investigation shift. The manuscript's path was no longer a mystery, but a matter of patience. Someone had betrayed themselves, not by confession, but by a pause over the word marginalia. In Flaxborough, that was as good as a signature. He collected his hat. Sergeant, he murmured, we'll be receiving a parcel soon. Love grinned. And if we don't? Then we ask our questions aloud, Pubright said. Even the ones written in the margins. The mayor's parlour, with its waxy ferns and portraits of men who disapproved of posterity, was chosen for the conclusion. Friday afternoon rain fretted at the leaded panes. The brass clock ticked with municipal patience. Inspector Pubright sat opposite the mayor with Sergeant Love behind him. On the other side of the table, Miss Teatley intent, Reverend Cleeve, grave and a shade too composed, Councillor Glossop, pink and defensive, and Dr. Clarice Houghton, alert and neutral. Pubright placed a small oak box in the centre. It had arrived by first post, wrapped in brown paper without a note. The lock was intact. He opened it with Miss Teatley's key and drew out a fat volume bound in tired calf. "The Manuscript," he said mildly. "Labelled Oxford Hall Debating Society Minutes 1897, it is that, and more. After the Debating Society dwindled, the volume was reused. Later papers were pasted in, trustees' notes and committee memoranda. The most interesting comes from 1926, Glossop attempted a laugh. Old history." "History," Pubright agreed, "whose margins speak." He turned the book so the others could see penciled annotations running beside the tidy ink. These, the marginalia, were added by a conscientious secretary. He cross-referenced names, land parcels, promises. He was, I think, a moralist with a fondness for pencils. Miss Teatley made a small, avid sound. Cleeve watched the volume as a man might watch a loaded tray. On pages 14 to 16, 32 and 47, the numbers helpfully jotted on a flower show raffle envelope, there is mention of a temperance rally and an improvements subscription. The notes point forward to an inserted paper of 1926, a meeting of the Oxford Hall Trustees Improvement Subcommittee. There, under an innocent heading about replacing the boiler, appears the purchase of a strip of land abutting the hall. "The seller is Alderman Percival Glossop." Glossop's face mottled.
"This is outrageous." "It is untidy," Pubright said.
"Outrage lives elsewhere. No crime is alleged now. The principals are long dead. But if read aloud in a crowded hall by a lively reporter, the entry would be misunderstood. It would be taken for present scandal." He set down the book.
"On Saturday, Reverend, you saw enough to realise that."
"You told Councillor Glossop that some pages were pastoral dynamite and should not be read in a noisy room. You then fetched your coat from the cloakroom, where the raffle envelope had been left with your aid memoir upon it. At the side door the draft was helpful. The manuscript box left by that route under your coat." Cleeve's hands, folded on the table, did not move. "If I had taken it," he said quietly, "it would have been to prevent a wrong reading." "Precisely," Pubright said. "A protector, not a thief. You did not break the lock." The broken brass key on the trestle came from the caretaker's ring, snapped earlier and left by someone attempting to tidy the evidence of an already opened door. "You took the box home, read by lamplight, and decided to return it by post this morning. Sensible." Cleeve's shoulders eased by a fraction.
"And the fire?"
"The fire was not yours," Pubright said. He looked at Glossop.
Councillor, you are an efficient man in a fluster."
You understood the Reverend's alarm and wished to be useful. You let yourself into the side office with your key and burned the September pages from the bookings ledger, thinking to spare the Reverend embarrassment by removing a note that he, too, had been issued temporary access, Glossop puffed.
"Nonsense. I know nothing of ledgers." A scrap in the bin reads, "Cleeve access key held by," Pubright replied.
It was perhaps a draft note, perhaps an entry. In any case, it gave you an idea. Unfortunately, you burned more than a note. We shall not trouble the fire service with it. The mayor shifted, relief and disapproval doing battle.
"Is there, Inspector, anything that requires action?"
"Only housekeeping," Pubright said. "The manuscript will go to the county archive. Miss Teatley will have a proper receipt. Dr. Houghton may, under supervision, consult it for her research. Reverend Cleeve will make a short announcement at Sunday evensong to the effect that historical records deserve quiet reading and not theatrical recital. Councillor Glossop will ensure that Oxford Hall's keys and registers are kept with greater care."
"No headlines will benefit from any of this?" Miss Teatley breathed out.
"And nothing was stolen? A thing misplaced and returned hardly counts as theft," Pubright said. The town may rest. Cleve looked at him. You are very kind. I am municipal, Pubright said. Kindness is a byproduct. He closed the book and slid it toward Miss Teatley. You guarded it for years. Now let the archive do so. Dr. Houghton adjusted her spectacles. I should like to contribute a note on cataloguing practice. Do, Pubright said. Glossop dabbed his brow.
And the press?
Mr. Harpenden will be told that order has been restored, Pubright replied. He may make poetry out of chrysanthemums. There was a small general loosening, the sound chairs make when they forgive people. The mayor thanked everyone. Tea was mentioned. Relief like the rain subsided into a steady drizzle. The meeting ended without melodrama, as all necessary meetings should. In the corridor, Sergeant Love murmured, Neatly done, sir. Neatness is the courtesy we pay to truth, Pubright said. He put on his hat. See the parcel to the archive this afternoon. As you please. They stepped out into the wet square. Oxford Hall sat in its accustomed respectability, the pond of Flaxborough's virtue unruffled once more. Pubright walked back to his office, thinking of margins, the small, penciled places where towns wrote what they could not quite say aloud. He preferred them that way. Loud truths were for other jurisdictions. Here, a paper placed quietly in the right drawer could do more than any trumpet. He took up his pen, opened his ledger, and resumed his paperwork. Saturday returned the town to itself.
Rain rinsed the high street.
Windows shone with ordinary faces. The butcher chalked up prices that offended no one more than usual. Oxford Hall stood closed and correct, its notices straightened, its new fireproof box humming like a small electric conscience. At 10, a county van drew up outside the station. Sergeant Love handed over the oak box while Miss Teatley supervised with ceremonial gravity. The clerk, beige with habit, produced a receipt in triplicate. Miss Teatley signed in her careful hand and dabbed the page with blotting paper brought for the purpose. Safest place for it? Love said. Safest place for us, Miss Teatley replied, and the clerk carried the town's excitement away, as if it were stationary. By noon the market had reacquired its comfort. Deprived of props, the story slipped back into tone, an account of how sensibly Flaxborough had behaved, how dignified the meeting, how prompt the archive, how polite the inspector. Those who had favoured the theory of the foreign tramp spoke less confidently. Those who had suspected half the council looked cheated. A few citizens, having missed the week entirely, inquired whether the incident concerned a bishop, a will, or a bypass, and were told it concerned bookkeeping. In the Chronicle office, Mr. Harpenden composed a leader. Order restored at Oxford Hall. He removed 3 adjectives, added 1, however, and printed a photograph of a van's rear doors which, he felt, captured the town's modesty exactly. His editor nodded and sent him to cover the cat. Show, Dr. Clarice Houghton presented herself at the county archive with a letter from the mayor. Under a glass weight, the volume opened and lay without temperament. She read quietly, turning municipal teacups into context, and context into a footnote about 1926. When she finished, she noted the catalogue number and thanked the clerk as though he had lent her time. Mrs. Bickerstaff, briskly disappointed, returned to Lincoln and wrote 3 letters offering to donate miscellaneous temperance memorabilia to any museum prepared to acknowledge her name on a plaque. On the train, she decided that a scandal postponed was as good as a sale. Reverend Cleve, after a short wrestling with adjectives, composed his evensong announcement. He used regret once and pride not at all. He would commend calm and ask that documents of the past be treated like elderly relatives, with kindness, comprehension, and limited audience. He rehearsed until it sounded like a shepherd's cough rather than a trumpet. Councillor Glossop discovered the restorative effect of activity. He delivered a new bookings ledger to Mr. Prynne and declared that standards would henceforth be modern. Prynne received the book, placed it in the fireproof chest, and returned to his doorknobs, where standards had been modern for 40 years. Later, Glossop repeated to anyone patient that he had long pressed for reform and found it almost convincing. Oxford Hall accepted a booking for the cat show. A notice depicting whiskers appeared, unsigned. Children peered at cages and whispered. Mothers negotiated between fur and coats. The hall, liking useful noise, approved. Pubright ate his sandwich in the little park behind the station. The pond considered him. He considered the pond. Secrets, he reflected, possess the temper of water. They seek low places, preserve what falls into them, and in the end present a surface in which everyone sees himself. The week had ended without heroics. A box passed from shelf to van. A ledger was replaced. Reputations resumed their ordinary expressions with the slightest of edits. Love arrived with 2 cups of tea.
Archive telephone, he said.
Receipt issued, rules recited, Dr. Houghton already reading by the time they rang. Excellent, Pubright said. We shall file this under Acts of Quiet. Love smiled. Press seems content? Give people a tranquil paragraph and they will forgive the absence of fireworks, said Pubright. It is the principal gift of local government. They sat in companionable weather. Beyond the railings, a boy lamented an ice cream and immediately forgot. The church bell tried the hour, decided against it, and waited. What next, sir?
Love asked. Paperwork, Pubright said.
The town is most itself when counted. He rose, easing his knee. And perhaps a request for an extra ashtray for the side office. Preventive policing? Interior decoration, said Pubright, and they returned to the station. On the inspector's desk lay the charred scrap bearing half the Reverend's name. Pinned not for evidence but memory, an exhibit in the Museum of Human Caution. Pubright wrote a note to the fire brigade, thanking them for their interest in a blaze that had declined to be dramatic. He wrote another to Miss Teatley, commending her steadiness and recommending stout envelopes for pamphlets. He initialed 3 forms, corrected a comma that aspired to be a semicolon, and set the archive receipt in the file. Outside, day's edge tidied the town. Lamps came on as if surprised to find themselves useful. The bus nosed down the hill with courtly patience. Shop blinds descended with the sigh of tame theatre curtains. In bay windows, people placed flowers beside photographs. Respectability, elastic, accommodating, covered the week without strain. Pubright closed his ledger and listened a moment to the station's small orchestra. Kettle prelude. Typewriter, obligato, the distant shoe of a constable hoping not to be noticed. He put on his hat, then decided to remain. There were still 2 forms and an invitation to the cat show to consider. He hummed faintly, tuneless as ever, the sound of a man content to prefer margins to headlines. The town, having shifted its chairs by an inch, sat down again. The manuscript slept among cousins. The hall prepared for whiskers. The Reverend practiced measured words. The counsellor rehearsed reform. The librarian polished a receipt. The reporter learned the names of breeds. The caretaker locked his doors and for once felt congratulated by their silence. Pubright turned a page, dipped his pen, and let the nib make its sensible path.